So there's this myth that AIPAC pays congresspeople and senators, and that's not actually true. I'm about to show you how these political donations actually work and why they matter. By now, we probably all know what AIPAC is, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. All of our presidents sure know what AIPAC is. And there's this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that they pay all of our politicians in order for them to support Israel, but they don't pay our politicians. See, when you look up who received the most pro-Israel money in the last election cycle, this is not money going into their pockets. This money is going to their campaigns. And that's how they get elected. Once they're elected, they do other things to get rich. Not to mention the political influence, prestige, connections that come with the positions. But when you actually look at who's receiving the most money and why they're receiving the most money, it's way more interesting. And just so all the censors know, I condemn anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and I'm only going to use very, very mainstream sources like Wikipedia, like Israeli news sources, and mainstream news journalism. None of this is controversial. This is all very public information. So in 2022, the top receiver of pro-Israel money in the House of Representatives was this woman named Chantel Brown, and she received over $1 million of campaign contributions. Why? See, most of you have probably never heard of this woman, and she's definitely not Jewish. But the key factor is that she only won by a narrow margin, and she was running against Nina Turner. And this was a very important seat for AIPAC and the Israel lobby. See, if we go to the ADL, they have a list of radical anti-Israel candidates in the 2022 primaries. And there's only like 6 people on the list, and one of them is Nina Turner, who has spoken out against Israel lobbying money. And she was a serious contender to win this congressional seat. Hence why this obscure politician you've never heard of received over $1 million of pro-Israel money. And looking at who they don't give money to is also really interesting, because on this list of really anti-Israel candidates, there's all these other people: Marco Amaral, Stephanie Gallardo, Max School, Rashida Tlaib. These first 3, their opponents didn't receive any Israel money, and that's because they had no chance of winning. Marco got 8.7% of the vote, Stephanie got 15.9% of the vote, and when you search for their opponents that beat them, they didn't receive any donations because there was no need. Obviously, when I talk about the reasons for these things, that's just me applying my speculation. The only facts I'm claiming are facts are what are in the sources that are very mainstream that I'm showing behind myself. The rest is just purely my opinion, freedom of speech. But there's a lot of other interesting dynamics that we can learn from this list too. Like if you look at Haley Stevens, the second highest recipient, that would be this lady, and she's not Jewish either, but she's very pro-Israel. And it just so happens that she was actually running against Andy Levin, who is Jewish and is also obviously very pro-Israel. And he's also one of the top receivers of money. So this Michigan seat, they had locked down. I don't know the exact dynamics of why, but they were backing both horses in that race. So next, Elaine Luria. Elaine is super Jewish, her whole family, tons of Jewish history. And she has historically been running very close races against this guy named Scott Taylor. 51%, 51%. So that was a big deal. But then this year, not against Scott Taylor, she was running against this woman, Jen Kiggins. And she actually lost, despite receiving $723,000 of campaign donations. And although she's super Jewish, it's not a huge deal because Jen Kiggins is also very pro-Israel. So I guess they'll take the L on that one. This picture becomes even more clear when you look at the 3 most critical voices in the House of Representatives against Israel is Cori Bush, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar. Sorry if I mispronounced all of your names. And the Israel lobby didn't give their opponents any money, even though they are extremely outspoken against Israel. Rashida Tlaib is actually Palestinian. But in all 3 cases, they win by large margins, like 69%, 68%, I can't quite read that small. Like, they're not at risk of getting unseated by their opponents. And so when you look up their opponents, none of them received any money because they figured no point in even trying. Next recipient, Josh Gottheimer, same story. He's Jewish and he was running a really close race and they wanted him to win. And now is where we get to the other part of the picture with Hakeem Jeffries, who received $439,000 in 2022. He is not Jewish and he was at no risk of losing the race, 72%, but he's super pro-Israel. They paid for a trip to Israel for him. He's been called one of the most pro-Israel Democrats in the House. He said, quote, back home in New York City, we consider Jerusalem to be the sixth borough. And in the last election cycle, 2020, they didn't really care. They only gave him 36,000 versus this election cycle, 439,000. That's like more than 10 times as much money. And it's probably because in the 2022 election cycle, he became the House Democratic leader. That's a lot of influence. Probably a pretty solid investment. Next is Andy Livin, who we already talked about, the Michigan double-double. And then we have Richie Torres. This one's really interesting. And this is the last one we'll do. See, Richie Torres is just a dude. He's actually one of the only congressmen who didn't go to college. But he is super pro-Israel. He's been called the House's loudest Israel supporter. And he was part of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is like the furthest left-leaning faction of the Democratic Party. But he left the caucus because of their stance on the Israel-Hamas war. We'll call it a war. And you know who else is on that caucus? Our three homies. So this is an opportunity for pro-Israel groups to get a voice that is very pro-Israel in this far left sort of enclave that is sort of against Israel. So all that money is a way for them to pick off a person in the sort of enemy camp. And I mean, it's pretty obvious why AIPAC would be investing in getting pro-Israeli politicians into the government, because we send them money every year, and we are one of the most important pieces of support in order to keep Israel in the position it is in internationally. But here's the kicker. This is a cool graph you've probably not seen. What's the overall impact of AIPAC? Well, here's a chart, and it's straight from Wikipedia, mainstream sources, and it's a timeline of the number of US senators that are Jewish over time. And this is back in like the 1800s, there's the 1900s. You know, there's only like 2% of the American population that are Jewish, right? So groovy, that makes sense. There's 100 Senate seats, 1 or 2, cool. But then what happened in 1948 that changed all of that? Again, from Wikipedia, now we have 9 out of 100 senators are Jewish. That is 9%. And 6% of the House of Representatives versus 2.4% of the population. And see, receiving the Israel money is not how you get rich. It's how you get on the team. And if you don't support the team, they can just as easily as they got you your seat, they can just as easily give the next person your seat and get you off the team. And if you don't have your seat, then how are you going to use your seat to become really, really rich? And trading on insider information is not the only way that Congress people get rich, but it's probably the most obvious way. This is the average of the overall stock market returns in 2023, 25% returns, good year. Congress members were making 240% returns. Holy shit. Brian's making Nancy Pelosi look like a fucking amateur. So anyways, I hope that clears up all these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It's totally just misinformation to say that AIPAC is making politicians rich and paying them money. It's not bribes. They're not paying them money. They're just helping to support democratic ideals. I mean, obviously, AIPAC's interests are America's interests. So it's a good thing that they can, influence who gets all of our political influence. And a great example of that is how all of our politicians voted to ban this Chinese app that we're all using to spread misinformation, because it's in America's best interest, in their best interest, to stop the Chinese from influencing what Americans think. Because if the Chinese could influence what Americans think, then the Chinese could influence who holds all the seats. And that would be really anti-democratic if another country could influence which American politicians were in charge. Right?